Reid's life was a careful orchestration of beige and quiet. He worked as an archivist, his days spent meticulously cataloging old documents in the hushed, climate-controlled rooms of a municipal records office. Each evening followed a predictable rhythm, a quick, utilitarian meal, a book, and then the deep, dreamless sleep of a man who left no loose ends. He found a certain comfort in the lack of surprise, the absence of sharp edges. His small apartment, functional and Spartan, reflected this philosophy. He wasn't unhappy, not precisely, he was simply unengaged. The disruption arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between a utility bill and a flyer for discount car insurance. It was a thick envelope, heavy cream paper, embossed with a legal firm's crest he didn't recognize. The solicitor's letter was concise, almost clinical. A distant relative, a man named Elias Thorne, had passed. Reid barely remembered Elias, a specter from a handful of strained family gatherings in his childhood, a figure cloaked in silence and an air of perpetual melancholy. The letter detailed a will, a sole beneficiary, and an inheritance, a property. An old cabin. Deep in the Blackwood Forest. Reid reread the address, a string of forgotten roads and landmarks that sounded more like a folktale than a geographic location. Blackwood Forest. The name itself felt like a clenching fist. He remembered whispers from his grandmother, tales of Elias Thorne and his strange dwelling, stories half-heard and dismissed as childish fancies, an ancient burial ground, a place where the veil was thin. He'd always assumed it was just local superstition, the kind of exaggerated lore that clung to isolated places. Now, the memory settled like a cold stone in his gut. The decision to go was less a choice and more an inevitability. His life offered no compelling reason to stay. He filed for leave, packed a single duffel bag, and set off. The drive was long, the landscape slowly shedding the familiar trappings of civilization. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to tracks barely wide enough for his sedan. The air grew heavy, smelling of damp earth, pine needles, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old pennies. The GPS signal flickered, then died, leaving him to navigate by the solicitor's hand-drawn map. He felt a growing sense of isolation, a creeping awareness of being utterly alone in a place that felt forgotten by time. The unease wasn't sharp, not yet, but a dull ache behind his eyes, a subtle tightening in his chest. Finally, the track opened into a small, overgrown clearing. The cabin stood there, hunched and sagging, as if the weight of the forest had pressed down on it for centuries. A thin, reedy wind sighed through the gaps in the wood, a sound that seemed less like air movement and more like a complaint. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic drip of water and the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. This wasn't just an old cabin, it was a presence, a watchful, patient thing. Reid stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. The cabin loomed, a monument to neglect. He walked slowly around its perimeter, his gaze sweeping over the warped planks and the single, sagging porch. The forest floor here was uneven, humped with tangled roots and mounds of earth. As he rounded the back, partially obscured by a cluster of gnarled, leafless bushes, he saw it. A section of the ground, curiously flat and unnaturally symmetrical, interrupted the wild growth. A heavy, rusted metal hatch, secured with a thick, iron bar, lay flush with the ground in the center. The metal was pitted and flaking, but the bar, despite its age, looked formidable, almost deliberately impenetrable. This wasn't a root cellar. This was something else entirely. An underground bunker. Its existence, a silent, grim secret nestled into the earth, felt like a deliberate challenge, a hidden heart to this already foreboding place. The cabin was just the beginning. Reid's initial days in the cabin were marked by an almost desperate attempt at normalcy. He unpacked his sparse belongings, arranged his books on a wobbly shelf, and tried to establish a routine that mirrored his carefully ordered life back in the city. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves, felt alien compared to the sterile, recycled breeze of his old apartment. Here, the silence was not the gentle hum of distant traffic but a profound, heavy quiet, occasionally punctuated by the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth or the mournful call of a distant bird. He spent his mornings attempting to clear out some of the cabin's accumulated debris, finding only more layers of dust and forgotten detritus. The evenings were the hardest. The flickering lamplight barely pushed back the encroaching shadows that clung to the corners of the rooms, making the familiar shape of a coat on a peg seem to shift into something else, something watching. He dismissed it as an overactive imagination, a natural consequence of isolation in an unfamiliar, ancient place. Then came the sounds. At first, he attributed them to the old house settling, a symphony of groans and creaks that were simply part of its venerable structure. A soft scratching, like nails on wood, would emanate from the walls near his bed, always just as he drifted to sleep. He'd rationalize it as mice, though he never saw any droppings or signs of their presence. Sometimes, a whisper, faint and indistinct, would seem to brush past his ear when he was alone in the main room, causing the hairs on his arms to prickle. He'd spin around, but the room would be empty, save for the silent, watchful furniture. One afternoon, he left a book, spine down, on the small table beside his armchair. He'd been halfway through a dense history text, a comforting anchor in the disquiet. Later, returning from fetching water from the hand pump outside, he found the book lying open, face down, on the floor, several pages past where he'd left off. A shiver traced its way down his spine. He picked it up, feeling the faint imprint of dust on the pages. A draft, he told himself, a sudden gust through a loose window pane. The disturbances, minor as they were, began to chip away at his carefully constructed calm. He started to check the locks more often, to scan the periphery of his vision for movement that wasn't there. The cabin, once a place of quiet refuge from the world, was slowly becoming a crucible of unease. It was during one such restless morning, driven by a need to simply do something, anything, that he ventured further into the overgrown property. He pushed through a thicket of gnarled branches and thorny bushes at the edge of the clearing, seeking out the boundary markers mentioned in the estate papers. His boot snagged on something solid, hidden beneath a tangle of weeds. Clearing away the debris, he uncovered a rusted, heavy iron hatch, almost swallowed by the earth. A crude, weathered padlock, corroded by decades of rain and frost, clung to its latch. Curiosity, a stronger instinct than his burgeoning fear, took hold. This was it, he realized with a jolt, the underground bunker mentioned vaguely in the old property deeds, dismissed as a root cellar or forgotten storm shelter. He retrieved a lantern from the cabin, its feeble light struggling against the gloom. The air inside the bunker was heavy, stagnant. A narrow, rough-hewn staircase descended into the earth, its wooden treads slick with moisture. He descended cautiously, each step echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The walls were rough stone, sweating with condensation. At the bottom, a small, square room opened up. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knelt, his fingers trembling slightly as he unlatched the heavy clasp. Inside, nestled amongst brittle, yellowed cloth, lay a collection of tarnished silver pendants, each engraved with a strange, looping symbol he didn't recognize. Beside them, wrapped in a faded velvet pouch, was a small, leather-bound journal. The ink was faded, but the urgency of the strokes was palpable, as if the writer had been racing against time, or something worse. A new, unsettling certainty began to bloom in Reid's chest. These weren't just old house noises or drafts. This cabin, and the secrets it held, were far more intricate, and far more menacing, than he had ever imagined. Reid's desperate grab at normalcy shattered. The cabin, once merely unsettling, began to shed its veneer of rustic charm with a malicious glee. The shifting shadows he'd initially blamed on the failing generator and his own fatigue now danced with an unnatural autonomy, elongating, twisting into grotesque caricatures along the rough-hewn walls. The scent of damp pine needles, once a comfort, curdled into something cloying and metallic, like old blood mixed with wet earth, particularly strong near the stone hearth. One morning, he woke to find his meticulously arranged books scattered across the floor, not fallen, but flung, pages dog-eared and spines cracked. A faint, slick residue coated the covers, leaving a faint, sickly sweet odor on his fingertips. He tried to rationalize it, a tremor, a draft, a rodent, but the books were too far flung, too deliberately disarrayed. Later, the old oil lamp on his bedside table, which he always extinguished before sleep, flickered into life on its own, casting a jaundiced glow on the ceiling, illuminating a web of cracks he'd never noticed before, cracks that seemed to writhe and expand as he watched. The sounds, too, grew bolder. The faint creaks and groans of settling timber escalated into distinct thuds from the floor above, even though the cabin had no second story. Whispers, like dry leaves skittering across bare ground, brushed against his ears when he was alone, too indistinct to form words, yet too deliberate to be the wind. He felt eyes on him constantly, a prickling sensation on his nape that made him shiver despite the warmth of the roaring fire. The breaking point arrived one blustery afternoon. He was attempting to repair a loose floorboard near the kitchen, a mundane task, when a heavy, antique-framed photograph of his distant relative, the one he'd inherited the cabin from, slid from the mantelpiece. It didn't fall, it launched itself across the room, striking the far wall with a violent crack that splintered the glass. The relative's eyes, fixed in the sepia-toned image, seemed to stare directly at him, a knowing, almost accusatory gaze. Reid stood frozen, the hammer dropping from his numbed fingers, clattering loudly on the floor. There was no tremor, no draft, no rational explanation for the sheer force of the impact. The cabin wasn't just old, it was active. It was hostile. He couldn't deny it any longer. His rational mind, the carefully constructed fortress of logic he'd lived within, crumbled. He was not alone in this isolated place. Something malevolent shared his space, twisting his reality, and it was escalating. He would find out what this was. His research began in the cabin itself. His distant relative, a man he barely knew, had been a recluse, and his belongings were a strange jumble of old books, journals, and maps. Reid spent hours sifting through dust-laden volumes on local history, forgotten folklore, and even obscure texts on ancient rituals. He found a tattered leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and yellowed, tucked beneath a stack of topographical maps. The handwriting was spidery, almost illegible, but as he painstakingly deciphered fragments, a horrifying picture began to emerge. Tucked within the journal's final, most frantic pages, was a faded, hand-drawn diagram. It was less a map and more a series of directions, starting from the cabin's foundation and leading to a point marked with an X deep beneath the earth. Scrawled next to the X in a shaky hand were the words, * the underground bunker, where the pact was sealed. The diagram was crude, but undeniable. It pointed to a hidden structure, directly beneath the cabin itself, a place his relative had clearly known about, perhaps even used. The cabin wasn't just built on an ancient burial ground, it was a cage, a monument to a forgotten horror, and he, Reid, was somehow tied to its gruesome history. The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with unseen anticipation, a suffocating tension that pressed in on him from every wall.